This episode is brought to you by The Guarantors. Facing rising renter fraud? Don't let fraudulent applications compromise your financial stability. The Guarantors provide a safety net that protects your rent roll and minimizes bad debt. Why risk it? Talk to The Guarantors and secure your property's financial health. Visit theguarantors.com/multifamily today. Welcome to another episode of the Multifamily Collective. This past week, I had the opportunity to catch up with KP Reddy. KP is the founder and managing partner for Shadow Ventures, a seed-stage venture firm focused on revolutionizing the built environment. He is also the author of Creating the Intangible Enterprise, Thriving in an AI-Driven Future. What you need to know about startups is wrong, which debunks 11 popular myths about entrepreneurship, and BIM for building owners and developers, the definitive guide to building information modeling. A technology innovator for over 3 decades, Reddy has been building startups since the earliest days of the internet. Now his passion lies in identifying and advising and investing in the market leaders transforming cloud computing, computational design, robotics, and AI. Now, while we spent some time talking about KP's recent book, Creating the Intangible Enterprise, we unpacked a plethora of other topics. For example, understanding the nature of harmonics in work, which was an interesting discussion. AI, the fact that it's been around for a long time, language and how that plays a significant role in transitioning to new technologies. We also talked about storytelling and the relationship building related to that. We talked about critical thinking. Rather, creative thinking is another topic, but we talked about critical thinking. We also talked about the combination of AI and human creativity and how AI has the potential to revolutionize healthcare, drug discovery, and space travel. We also talked about the rise of deepfake technology. And we also talked about AI and how that may change the nature of work and get this one's self-worth, which is a very interesting piece of this discussion. So, as is tradition, grab your favorite beverage. For me, it's free reign during this conversation, American Dirt. And kick back, relax, and enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with KP Reddy. KP, welcome to the show.
Hey, Mike.
How are you doing as of late?
I am fantastic. Busy as can be. I don't think, I hate even saying that because busy is just a constant. I don't think it's new news, right?
I don't think so. I think, I recall back to the time I met you in Phoenix, Arizona. We were riding a bus to a mountain where we did a hike. It was part of a Multifamily Innovation Council. And I think at that time you were busy and working on several different startups. And here we are today. You're busy. And my imagination tells me you're working on startups.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Well,
doing the same.
Like I had
more
to,
of it.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe to set the stage for our conversation today, you've been, I'm going to use busy as a segue. You have a newborn in your life. You just wrote a book and you've just started a new fund. And so it makes me wonder, why are you busy?
I will say, doing all those things, we've kind of talked about it before, is like everybody optimizes for a singular cadence of work. And the reality is, depending on the work you're doing, it has its own natural harmonics of how it works. Raising a fund, you don't meet with a billionaire one day and you close a deal the next day. There's just a very natural cadence to how people operate when you're asking investors for money. And you have to kind of tune into that harmonics of things. And if you do that, like when you talk about the fallacy of quality of life, work-life balance, all those things, I've just found that if you can figure out what the harmonics of all the things in your life are, you have really good expectations about how long things take, and you invest accordingly in the right amount of cadence at the right time. So, it's still a lot.
I imagine it helps that you have an incredible team around you. It doesn't put any less tax on you necessarily. It just shifts that tax to something else in your life. But you have an incredible team that surrounds you, at least as it relates to the venture part of your life. Is that right?
Yeah, 100%. I think also, the gray hairs become meaningful, right? You start to understand things. This book is actually my third book,
That's
and
right.
my approach to writing has just gotten different. Like I know myself now. I know when I'm in the zone, I need to keep going and knock it out. And in the first 15 minutes, I know if I'm not in the zone, go do something else. Right? Don't force it. So I think just as you get more experience, you know yourself better, and you are better at accepting the realities of yourself.
I think that's right. You become a little more forgiving, a little more graceful. Yeah.
Right. 100%.
So you wrote Creating the Intangible Enterprise, and then I'm going to call this a subtitle, even though it's above and I consider sub below, but who knows? The critical skills required to thrive in an AI-driven world. And certainly AI, I know AI has been around probably since the 50s, plus or minus, and maybe you can unpack that a little bit.
Mhm.
But as of late, it seems like last October, November, when ChatGPT made its way into the scene, it sort of exploded, and that's on the heels of AI winters and AI summers and AI winters and AI summers. But you wrote a book about this, and I'm just interested. What was the catalyst for you? Maybe it's obvious, but what was the catalyst for you to write this book?
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, it's a great question because it's one of those things I ask myself every day. Why did I do that? Especially after I finish a book, I'm like, I'm never doing that again.
Yeah.
But I also have the memory of a goldfish, so I kind of forget those things. But what I think my driver, I was trying to think through like what's the pattern of motivation for me. And when I see people, my first book was on BIM, building information modeling, which was a new technology. It's more of a textbook, kind of boring. My second book was on startup culture, and this book's about AI. And I think the pattern there is when I see people experiencing a lot of fear, experiencing a point of transition, it really motivates me. I feel like, I'm not in the book selling business, I'm a venture capitalist, right? So for me, it's an expression to reach the masses that I think are in some point of confusion. I always say, FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's a massive stressor. So that's sort of the pattern I've seen before, whether it was with BIM coming onto the scene. There was a startup grind culture that was very popular for a minute that was very disturbing to me, that everybody thought, oh, I'm going to drink Soylent, I don't even have to eat, and I'm going to work 7 days a week, like just that grind culture. So that motivated me to go, oh, this is not good. I need to help folks. And then with AI, there were a couple of events where I was giving talks on AI, like executive briefings. And I didn't realize how emotional people were getting about this. I had someone accuse me like, you have kids. How can you do this to the future of your kid? Like, what do you think about your kid's life? You're ruining it. This is the problem with you technology people. Like I was getting like aggressively, getting into some aggressive banter with some people at these talks. And I realized just how fearful people were. And when I would say, look, we have a way of, there's been lots of technologies, steam engine, we have all these technologies that have been developed. It's worked out fine. And people like kind of called me out on it and said, hey, like, that's kind of naive. Like, you can't just say it'll be fine. Like, help us understand what that looks like. So my thinking was, let me write something that has some history of here's how technology shaped different businesses, and really get people around the optimism and the opportunity to leverage the technology.
Yeah, before we dive in further than that, you raised a point in my head with sort of these transitioning technologies, and I think the one that comes to mind that is most pronounced for me is like the automobile, right? And on the heels of horse and buggy, there was an automobile, but it didn't put everybody out of the horse and buggy business necessarily, right? They just kind of upskilled, reskilled, or figured out a different. But the question I want to ask is, how important do you think it is? Because in a car has horsepower, right? And the reason people did that, called it horsepower, was to help the human sort of segue, right? How important do you think language is in transitioning from one kind of disruptive technology to a different way of living?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hugely important. I think word choice, I'm a big fan of like word choice being very, words absolutely matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think to that point, what are people calling most AI? Copilot,
That's right.
not pilot,
That's
not
right.
AI overlord, Copilot, right? You are still part of it. They're your co-pilot. You're still flying. You're still flying. But when you need help, get your co-pilot sitting next to you. And so that is like a very good example of the explicit word choice to describe how we're going to use AI.
That's a great example. I literally had not thought about that. I'd heard the word copilot, but I had not thought about it that way.
Yeah.
So you mentioned history of AI, maybe just to frame the future or the carry on of this conversation.
Mhm.
Can you frame AI up in a kind of a little snapshot history of dating back to the early innings of
Yeah.
what is AI today?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is like AI has been around for a long time. We've been hypothesizing about it. I always say like, I'm not a futurist. If you want a futurist, go talk to a science fiction writer, right? Like,
Cory
we've had
Doctorow.
Hal, it's manifested in so much in pop culture, right, over the
That's
years, that it's not new news. And what's really happened is it's been an intersection of computing power that's mattered and the de-skilling of being able to build and train models. The example I use about almost 10 years ago, actually over 10 years ago, I was hired as a consultant by a law firm. This was 10 years ago, to build an AI tool to do discovery on construction litigation.
Mm.
So the idea was look at the construction contract, monitor the email exchanges, and start flagging emails that are a concern in the contract, right? So that was the whole idea. We spent about 3 years, somewhere on the order of $5 million, building this. To which point the law firm said, hey, thanks for your work. We're going to buy you out of your contract because we don't know how to charge clients for this.
Oh.
And when clients start asking us for something like this, then we'll turn it back on, right? But the reality is what took us that much effort and multiple PhDs and using archaic languages with the lowest overhead to write it in. Because you wanted as much compute possible going to the processing. You try to create like code bases with low overhead. You could probably build in a weekend these days.
That is, and for low cost, low to
And for
no
low
cost.
cost, right? So that's the real shift. And the other example I use back during the .com, which is where I kind of had my early success as a kid, was, when I was building e-commerce websites, we built one for Blue Nile. We charged them millions of dollars because we had to write like, we need to write code to define a shopping basket, a shopping cart. I remember saying like, oh, how do we like make sure that things stay in their shopping cart if they open up a new browser? And is it going to work on Netscape and Internet Explorer? Like, it was just very, very complicated. All
Yeah.
that features that we built back then, you can now buy with Shopify for $99 a month. Shopify provides everything you need to start an e-commerce site, right? So I
Yeah.
think what really happened when ChatGPT came out was one, I think there's two dynamics. One is, I can actually use AI. I don't have to be a rocket scientist.
Yeah.
And two was the socialization of AI. Because we know we have been subjected to AI. We're recording this. Apple came out with what they're calling Apple Intelligence, of course.
Right.
But, Siri came out several years ago. Wasn't great, right?
Right.
But so we've been subjected to AI. Netflix prompts us with what movies we should be watching, and of course we turn around and binge watch them.
Yes,
Since
we do.
AI technology has been in the background, but there was a real question, even like a lot of the things that motivated me for my book, there was a real question, is society ready? And what you saw was ChatGPT's launch and the interest, the intellectual interest, and people, the social, in the zeitgeist, everybody's talking about AI and using it. Then it's like, okay, like we're okay with AI.
Yeah.
We're not worried about it, right? We're having fun with AI, right? Which is always the first step. Have fun with new technology and then take it seriously later, right? Internet was like that.
Yeah.
We all had fun with it at first. So I think from that perspective, it kind of said, oh, AI is our friend. It's our co-pilot. And so people started adopting it. Because if you see the pattern of all the big tech companies and how quickly they were able to respond with, oh, we have AI, they didn't start from scratch. They've been working on this stuff. They
Right.
just weren't telling you about it.
Pulled the curtain back.
Yeah, like, oh, it's okay to talk about AI now.
Do you feel do you think rather so you travel to a number of conferences many times to speak, but do you get a sense out in the marketplace that sometimes or a lot of times that people are touting AI when it's not really AI? It's just a sort of a marketing ploy with an organization. Do you see a lot of that in your travels?
Yeah, 100%. It's early innings, right? I have to pattern, I have to kind of assume human behavior is human behavior.
Sure.
It kind of doesn't
Yeah.
change. During the .com, right, there were people like setting up website. Oh, we have a www dot, right? They were like, oh, we're using the internet. Then you go to their website and there's nothing going on. I remember companies that were like, oh, we're doing e-commerce. And it turned out like after you filled out your form, it prompted you to print it out and fax it to them.
Yeah. I
Right?
remember that.
Right. So people, early adoption, and I kind of have this running rant joke about like all the people talking about AI right now were the same people talking about Web3, were the same people talking about crypto, were the same people talking about NFTs. Like there are these like trend spotting people that whatever the next new thing is, they are all of a sudden an expert at it and they're speaking at every conference. So those people are out. So be cautious about, about that part. But I think for me, the biggest dynamic about what we're going through is not since the BlackBerry has a CEO walked down to IT and said, what are we doing about this? Right? The BlackBerry, they saw their buddies on the golf course checking email and they're like, hey, that guy's playing more golf because he has a BlackBerry. First thing that CEO did is walk down to IT and like, I need a BlackBerry. Everyone
Right.
has a BlackBerry. I need a BlackBerry, right? And what's happened with AI now that CEOs have AI on their phone and they don't need IT, they're playing with it. They're having some imagination. It's releasing some ideation and some enthusiasm. And so they're walking down to their IT department saying, what are we doing about AI?
It's true.
Well, IT has to react, right? So those reactions are the first manifestations of AI adoption that you might see at a conference. Like, oh, we're using AI. Well, why are you using AI? Because a CEO came and yelled at me and said, we need to have an AI strategy. But that's also very powerful. That's why my optimism around adoption and what's happening is, as board of directors, I've been asked by several public companies, hey, can you be on our AI committee for our board?
Mm.
When it's happening at that level, whether it's good, bad, or otherwise, it's going to happen. Right?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's, right, wrong, or indifferent. A lot of change is driven from the top down. And when you get a CEO or a COO or even a CFO interested in a type of tech or even a business process system, whatever, it doesn't matter. They're going to drive that change. I'm wondering through that lens, is it more about beyond the interest, right? The kind of the base interest. Is it more about efficiencies in effort and or cost savings? What are some of the themes that are born out of those kind of committee board discussions that you're
Yeah.
seeing or hearing?
So I call it the red pill, blue pill moment, right?
Okay.
And that is and there's something in between, obviously. But if you look at, I'm going to use AI to do the things that I've always done, but just do it cheaper, better, faster. My belief system is that's a race to the bottom. If you look at AI and say, now I have the ability to get into new businesses and new business models, that's more interesting. That's a growth opportunity. Because on the first hand, if you talk about like, oh, let's just become operationally efficient, you might get a step ahead of your competition for a moment. But in the book, I talk about Moneyball, right? Moneyball was very popular. Now we don't talk about it because everybody has Moneyball.
That's
So
right.
at some point, your competitive edge and at the speed at which change is happening, you might have a competitive edge for 30 days, 60 days, because the low-hanging fruit of AI is so self-evident. All your competitors are doing it too,
Sure.
right? You're not doing it. But now you start thinking about you contemplate, right? Like, what new businesses could I be in?
Yeah.
How does my existing business model relevant? Like, that's where things get super interesting. And that's the path to creating the when I talk about, the intangible enterprise, that's where I'm really focused on this optimism of like, hey, we can create whole new businesses. And I believe that also could be a whole new wave of entrepreneurship, just like you saw with the internet. I mean, think about like Etsy and all these people selling things and doing things on eBay and everything else. There's a lot of people that got to be entrepreneurs and kind of live their best lives doing what they want to do. And I think AI is going to really take people that have great ideas. And then you have this great idea, and then there's this friction of, oh, I need to hire a software engineer. I have to hire this like, well, now I can't do it. I don't have that kind of money. But guess what? With AI, you can probably get pretty far down the road all by yourself. And when I talk to my VC friends in Silicon Valley, the running bet is who's going to be the first solo founder to build $1 billion company?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because they might be able to. I mean, just think about what we're doing here, right? We're using technology, but there's so much AI technology for podcasts and videos to annotate, to create clips, to do all this stuff. You don't need a team of video and audio editors. So now all of a sudden the creator economy, if you have good ideas and thinking, you will excel in the future, right? If you just want to be me too and I'm going to do whatever everybody else is doing, it's probably a problem.
Yeah. I think you've said so much there that I was like, one of the things that has become pronounced to me over the last couple of years, to one of your points, is that the business interruption is really about, we have this traditional hierarchy in business, right? You have this person at the top, they have 3 people reporting to them, and so on and so forth. And to the point that you just made, $1 billion company, 1 person, the entire hierarchy, traditional hierarchy, can be wiped out, right? Because if you have a question about human resources or marketing or whatever, you are talking to your co-pilot to do execution of said thing, right?
Right.
Is that the way to
100%. And I think as much as we get caught up in this AI thing and, and what I talk about in the book, when I talk about the traits and skills, right, that we need to build to thrive, it's not what people think. I'm like, it's about storytelling. It's about relationship building. Because now what happens, let's say you're a mid-career person at an accounting firm and you're like, man, my clients love me. I'm good at my job. I'm working 100 hours a week and giving all the money to the powers that be. And I'm being told you need to work hard and grind it out and, pay your dues and you get to be partner one day. Well, why can't I take that client with me? Well, because then I have to go get office space and recruit all these people and have this capacity to serve the customer. Maybe not anymore. Maybe you can walk out that door with 10 customers, leverage AI, and have the work capacity of 100 accountants. Because what's going to really matter is your relationship with the customer and that extra level of intelligence and critical thinking that you can put on the facts, right? It's that last 10% is what clients pay for.
That's right.
Right? The 90% of bookkeeping and filling out the forms and all. No, like when we deal with our accountants around tax time, we can fill out the forms ourselves. We don't need accountants for that. What you're paying for is like, hey, here's what I did. I shifted this over here and that there because of the need. That's what you're really paying for, that last 10%. And so I think customers acknowledge that the brute force, or what I call the salt mine work, if AI is handling it, I think why not walk out the door as an accountant and start your own firm? And so now we're back to these weird fundamentals like, oh, relationships matter. It's not about marketing drip campaigns. Like, oh, it's weird. Like now all of a sudden deep relationships matter. Storytelling matters. Critical thinking matters. It's kind of funny. Like I have a lot of attorneys because of my job, but I have a personal attorney that I keep around who is terrible at delivering deliverables. If I'm like, hey, can you review that contract and make some comments and get it back to me? Can you do it tomorrow? He's like, yeah, man, no problem. Tomorrow comes and goes. Next week comes and goes. And then at some point, it just never happens, right? So what I figured out was I'm going to have other lawyers that are good at cranking out deliverables, do that work, and have him get on a call with him for an hour, pay him for an hour of his time, review it all, and give me some creative insights on it.
Yeah.
And so I look at him, he's a brilliant lawyer, but now he struggled to have clients because he couldn't do the grunt work. He couldn't do the deliverable work. And there weren't enough clients that were willing to pay for him just to give like creative thought to the problems that they were solving.
Yeah, I think there is so with this technology, the freeing up of that creative mind and all the things that you just cited is just in my head. Once we go through this transition period, it's just going to free up this windfall of creativity that people will be able to put out into the world and then have the tools back of that. I want to unpack two things related to that you said, two terms. One is storytelling. Talk to me about storytelling as it relates to new enterprises in the future, because storytelling I think it's a little bit of an art and a little bit of a science, but how important is it? And maybe demonstrate through example, if you can, when you're answering how important it really is.
I think it's super important because if on the back end, AI is doing a lot of the work, right? And I don't think AI cannot tell great stories because AI does not have human experiences, right?
Right.
So part of what I think with storytelling, why it becomes so important, is that's what people are buying, right? Apple is not the best technology. It's very expensive. It's not the cheapest, right? So
that's right.
The whole cheaper, better, faster does not apply to Apple, apparently. It's like the opposite of that. However, less so these days, but Steve Jobs, masterful storyteller, right? Genius and great storyteller.
That's right.
Just sucked you in, right? So I think when you think about market differentiation and why people do business with people, it's so important. It's really interesting. In my day job as a venture capitalist, part of my job is to write checks, but it's also to raise capital. Mm-hmm. And what you find out when you're dealing with large capital allocators, we all kind of show up with the same pitch deck. Here's our IRR, here's our hypothesis, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. What they buy into is two things: is the relationship you build with them and them having a great understanding of how you got to where you are. What's your story? Because they feel like that, one, it's a personalization, but it's also in many ways, it's data to talk about how you look at the future, right? And how you're thinking, because it's a 10-year relationship. An investor is with you for 10 years. So if they don't love the story that you tell about your past, they're not going to love the story of the future. And so much of the human engagement has nothing to do with cheaper, better, faster, right? It has a lot to do with the storytelling. And am I buying in? Am I buying into it, right?
Yeah.
And that visceral feeling of being part of something is what drives people. That's all they want.
We will get right back to the episode after a word from our sponsor. Attention, multifamily pros. If you haven't heard of the Guarantors, take note. They provide insurance products that ensure you will ultimately and simply collect what's owed if a resident stops paying. Widen your applicant pool, turn conditionally approved and denied applicants into residents, and protect against the financial threat of renter fraud, all at no cost to the operator. With awesome customer service and a complete risk mitigation suite, it's a no-brainer. Visit theguarantors.com/multifamily and speak to their team today. That's right. It seems to me, in part, storytelling is really that prompt for creating emotion in another. And then when you back that up with data, that emotion that you've prompted in somebody else you can insert that data in that emotionally loaded moment, and that's what either drives it forward and or tears it apart or causes it to fall apart.
Yeah.
I think the other question I'd like to ask as it relates to that is critical thinking. I've worked in business for 30 years. I'm sure you've been around 30 plus or minus. I'm just guessing there, only based on the remark you made about gray hair. But the critical thinking skill, I've seen it so many times where an analyst, I'm just going to pick on an analyst. This is true for everybody. Analyst puts together a bunch of data, hands it to someone like myself or somebody else. And I'm like, well, okay, well, what do you think about this? Well, I don't know. You just asked me to put the data together, right?
Yeah.
Well, so talk to me about how important what it is. Mm-hmm. Let's just get real granular.
Yeah.
What is critical thinking and why is it so important? I'd rank it up there with storytelling.
Yeah. Critical thinking is an interesting thing, right? There's the analytical side of decision making, risk reward, right? Whatever your vectors of decisioning are, that's the very analytical part. Then you layer the experiential part, right? So I've worked with people that love that their analysts are not thinking because they don't want that process to be biased by what they think.
Ah, okay.
Right? Because they want them to be, which if that's what you want, AI will do a much better job than a recent MBA grad, right? Because if that's all you want, if you don't want any thinking around it or opinions around it, so critical thinking I always view as there's the analytical decision tree stuff, but then there's the layer of your experiences where you're like, hey, there's a pattern recognition. It turns out every time I've done that, it didn't work out. It didn't align with the data. Now, with that said, pattern recognition is so biased based on your own personal experience. Like I like to make these broad comments and people go, KP, you can't just say that, and my wife will say, hey, are your shoulders, sore? And I'm like, why? She's like, you're taking that big old brush, just painting the universe with that one big brush that this is how things are. Right. Like, oh, yeah, okay, fine. But it was like I was having this conversation about investing in startups in like tertiary markets, right? People have moved to Lake Tahoe or Asheville or all these great places with high quality of life. And I made a comment, I don't think I'll ever invest in a founder that runs their business out of one of those places. Someone's like, that's just like a broad brush. And I'm like, well, my experience has been the quality of life is so good that they're not working on the business. And they hire people that move there that came for the quality of life and aren't going to work like I expect them to work as a founder, right? Like they made a life decision to be somewhere where things are a little bit slower and a little bit more intentional versus someone that lives in New York City that's trying to pay the rent and keep good, So someone's like, well, you can't just broad brush say that. I'm like, well, I can say it. Absolutely, I can say it. But it's also my experience, right? And so much in venture investing, when we talk about pattern recognition, it's very experiential. That's why it's really hard to be young and be in venture capital because it's not nearly as analytical. Like the critical thinking part, there's a higher bias towards your experiences than the data. The data is simple. Big market, big problem, blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
And it's also why there's a lot of problems with venture capital when it comes to diversity, et cetera, because if I've had a great experience with a Harvard grad, the last 3 founders were Harvard MBA grads, that creates a bias towards my next 3 founders. I want them to be Harvard MBA grads, right?
Sure.
Whether it's true or not, right? The bias in our pattern recognition is often flawed and definitely not open to interpretation in many ways.
Yeah, you sort of have these recency effects, all these sort of things that kick into your mental model that you use to make decisions on a go forward. This might be a little bit of an off ramp, but I'm going to ask this question in an obvious way, but I'd like you to potentially talk about it. The constraints, the importance of constraints as it relates to building something. The lead singer of Aerosmith, I remember reading one time that in the early innings of the band becoming the prominent band that it is today, they did a lot of like small shows in small venues, and they were generally on very small stages. And so the lead singer of Aerosmith is the guy who does this, right?
Right. Yep.
I always confuse him and the Rolling Stones guy. But anyway, the story was that he did this because it differentiated his band from the next band, right? Mm-hmm. Because the small stage, the constraint, was the catalyst for him to do that, where most guys just stood there and just did their thing. They played their drums, they stroked the guitar, whatever. But he stood out. How important is a constraint when you're building something, a startup? How important is that constraint to the success?
Possibly the most important thing. And there's lots of, I always say like civilians that are not part of venture and the startup ecosystems, right? As a civilian, you look at a company raising $1 billion and then they go out of business. For a civilian, $1 billion is a lot of money. In the world of venture and startups, it's like, oh, it's a starting point, right? Like there's a little bit of a different mindset around money, right? We're a lot less emotional about money because it's mostly not our money, right? It's other people's money.
Sure.
And so there's lots of, how people waste money, right? In startup world because they raise so much money. Adam Newman at WeWork, right? But what happens is when you have constraints and you're presented with 3 options and you can only do one, it really helps you like sharpen your mental knife, right? To say, well, if I do this one, here's what my near-term opportunities are, but it might affect my long-term opportunities. Oh, this other one, it's going to be great for the long-term. My near-term, like you really have to go deep. And when you can say, oh, I can do all 3, take a child to an ice cream store and tell them that they can have as much of anything they want, right? Versus saying, no, you get to pick one scoop. You get one scoop. That's all you get. And think about how much time that child spends looking into the ice cream cabinet and like, but Dad, like, I really want this, but I also want to try that. Like it's a 15-minute decision to be made just to pick a flavor of ice cream.
That's right.
Because it's critical to a child, right? It's critical. Oh my gosh, like I got to pick the right one, right? And so I think the constraints, and by the way, when you have those constraints, the amount of intensity you can put on the things that you choose to do and measure them and pivot from them is really big. I think constraints, are just so important. And a lot of startup founders they're very quick to raise money for the wrong reasons. And the wrong reasons are that they're living highly constrained and they want to give themselves some breathing room versus saying, oh, it turns out if I had more capital, I could scale this well. So if you think about building a business, the analogy I use is as a founder, the things that you should build on your own without other people's money it's like a car. I need 4 wheels, I need a motor, I need a steering wheel, and I need a chair. And capital is your fuel.
Mm.
And if you follow it that way, like, don't ask investors to put in a steering wheel, right? The capital is to get you to your next stop. When you get to your next stop, maybe you can afford some, ABS and power steering and a better paint color or whatever. But if you think about it that way, there's no point in putting fuel in the tank if you only have three wheels and no tires, right?
Right.
So I think there's a lot of thinking that kind of has to go into that. And I think constraints are fantastic. It's also the root of ideation, right? It's also the root of ideation.
That's right. Steering back on to the freeway, to stick with the analogy loosely, how do you advise, if you do, if you don't, maybe you just speculate on, how do you advise an incumbent, as it relates to AI, and then the startup who, in my head, they're utilizing every tool available to them, maybe within the confines of constraints, but you have this incumbent that has sort of legacy everything, right? And they see the startup field here, and you get companies that just get upended. You think about taxis and Uber, right? Or there are many other examples. That's just the one that comes to mind. How do you think about advising people in that legacy versus startup world?
Yeah, so I think when I talk to a lot of the large incumbents, what I really look at is like, how are you using AI to reduce your expenses, right? Maybe one of the biggest benefits of AI is being able to write more code faster, better code faster, right? So maybe you can let go of some engineers, reduce your expenses there. But mostly whatever you deploy customer side is probably going to be AI as a feature. In other words, I'm an accounting software. I'm going to use AI to, I can ask my AI about my accounts receivable or something, right? It's not going to be game changing. It's going to be more feature enhanced on the core product. And I think you have to do that just to stay relevant, quite honestly. Beyond that, it's going to be really hard to change a business model and launch something new, just because large companies go through this thing where if it's not big enough to move the needle, then why bother? So if you look at that, why is Microsoft investing in a lot of AI companies? Why is Amazon, So what you're doing is you're optimizing your core business that's a cash cow to generate all that cash, and then you're redeploying that cash into other companies that you think have a greater growth potential. Because moving the needle at Microsoft, for them to grow 20% a year, like, that's a huge number.
Yeah.
But can they deploy their capital and get that growth velocity on their capital somewhere else? It's really what they're kind of focused on. So that's kind of the strategy.
That makes sense. I read a book. I've just a couple of more questions. I want to be respectful of your time. I read a book recently called The Power Law, by Sebastian Malady, and he in there he kind of talks about, in the venture world there was this oh, look at that, that's it. That's the book we're talking about. So that is really awesome. We did not plan that, by the way. Yeah. There's this sort of history in venture, and I don't blame this on venture capitalists, but rather founders who put themselves in a position of strength and took away a lot of power. But there was this sort of runaway mania in the venture world where billions and billions and billions get pumped into these intangible enterprises. Going back to the title of your book, right? These intangible companies, intangible meaning they had no rev, they had no cash flow, they weren't even out on the horizon, any sight of cash coming into the deal. Do you worry that AI, whether it's from a venture perspective, from a founder's perspective, or any other perspective, do you worry that AI is going to accelerate the pace of this mania, and you're going to have an outsized sort of FOMO about an industry, and people are just going to run in with, put all the chips in and end up?
It doesn't worry me that much, because, like in Power Law, right? I talk about it in my book as well, is like asymmetric models.
That's right.
part of power law is this asymmetry. You make 10 bets, 9 go to nothing, and one of them becomes the next Google. That still exists, right? But it's one of these things where you have to go make the 10 bets. And sometimes they're Google and sometimes they're Ask Jeeves, right? Like they're not always, they don't always work out. But that's the business model, right? So when people ask me as a VC, like, why are your expectations for returns so high? It's like, because within a given cohort, 9 people fail, right? 9 companies fail. So it's super important that that you do those things. And I think it's also important, and this is one of these things where when we talk to investors about venture capital, investing in venture capital, if it's purely based on returns, that's not the reason. Because if you look at the history of VC, there's a handful of funds that really return great capital, and there's some that, most of them, you can invest in the S&P and do better, quite honestly.
Right. That's right.
And part of it is you have to have this mission that says, I'm also going to drive innovation. I want to make the world a better place. Whatever your definition of the world a better place, right? Everybody has their own definition.
Sure.
And that those failures are massive learning experiences that might yield the next thing. Right. And I think that is, it's like the smartphone. Apple did not invent the iPhone.
That's right.
I mean, invent the smartphone. They invented the iPhone. There were plenty of people back to the Palm Pilot, right? There were plenty of people that tried this. HP had a smartphone. Dell had a smartphone before all of this, right?
That's right.
And they don't have them anymore. Right? So sometimes as a VC, you make bets and you have to feel like, if the worst case is I lose all my money, which is the worst case you have,
right?
What did it contribute? What's the learning there? And it's interesting. We're now in a cycle where we haven't had a lot of write-offs yet. It's just the age of our funds and things. But we're now having some conversations with some founders that may not make it. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of my founders are shocked when I say, so what do you want to do next? And they're like, I just lost money. I just lost $2 million of your money. And you want to keep working with me? I'm like, why would I want to work with someone off this? Like, I know you now. I know what your strengths and weaknesses are. Right. Did the business fail because you were lazy? No. Was it a bad idea? No. Like we created a relationship for a reason, and those reasons are still valid. He didn't steal, right? I mean, if things like that, of course, I'm not going to do something with you again. But if you acted ethically and put in the grit and the work, and the idea just didn't work out, or the market shifted, let's go do something. What's next? Let's go do something else. And I think founders are really shocked by that. But I think you have to have that mindset. And there's going to be billions of dollars to get wasted on this AI cycle. But what I would say is it's not really wasted. Whatever they learn, it'll be applied to the next thing, right? Google bought DeepMind 2014, I think, 10 years ago to launch their AI stuff, and they did nothing with it. All those folks have gone off and are doing other things now. They made a bunch of money by selling to Google. Google's probably written off all that money, but they're going to go do something.
Yeah, that's right. It's an interesting landscape that we look at. I consider it, like, to your point, sunk costs. It's really the price of education. And then the real important point is making application of those learnings in this next thing. And that's really wise of you to keep the band together, so to speak, for all of the learnings that you've experienced, right? And it accelerates the pace of the next potential success for that founder.
It really does. And I think when you figure out, people ask me, like, one of my jobs, right, I think, is being community builder. And why that's so important is you can't do it alone. You can't do any of it alone.
So true.
And to build your community, I always say I try to meet people where they are, right? Sometimes people can write a multi-million-dollar check into my fund. Fantastic. Sometimes people are listening to my podcast or following, like, perfect, right? Like, that's great, right?
Yeah.
I'll meet you where you are in terms of how you're thinking about things. And I think part of working with founders, even if things don't work out, is you're continuously building a community. I mean, look at the PayPal mafia, right?
That's right.
I mean, the PayPal exit was fine. It's nothing compared to what they've all gone off and done.
No.
And they all work together. I've had some experience with them, and it's fascinating how quickly they move together, because part of like relationship building is understanding people's strengths and weakness and what drives them.
That's right.
And I think that just takes time. It really takes time.
That I want to ask you one last question before we let people know where to find you. But when you look, somebody who has such a sort of worldly view as it relates to technology, certainly venture capital, certainly business in general, you think, and I know I'm asking you to speculate here, but 5-10 years down the road, what most excites you and what most concerns you about AI in the ecosystem now?
Yeah, I think the strides that we're going to make in healthcare are just going to be massive. We're already seeing early results of that. Whether it be drug discovery, et cetera, I think it's going to be game changing. I think what you're seeing with space travel, right? What AI is doing to co-pilot all the, I like watching those old movies like Apollo 13 or whatever, right? And there's like all these math people with pocket protectors running calculations, trying to figure out how to save the Earth from this asteroid, like all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
You just don't need all those people to, like, computers can do a lot more calculations and run more scenarios than a human could ever do, which means you'll have higher success rate, whether it's space travel or drug discovery and things like that. I'm very optimistic about that. I do worry about criminals, right? I've already seen lots of examples of deep fake stuff that you can do. You and I are on podcasts or whatever. I can create a deep fake of either of our voices in under 5 minutes.
Yeah.
It's not hard.
True.
And then if I know anything about your personal life, I can send your wife a voicemail.
Right. That's right.
Right? That stuff scares the crap out of me, right? Like, I was joking around with my wife. He's like, hey, we need to have code words.
Seriously.
We need to have code words, right? So that stuff. And the problem with that is people are like, oh yeah, like it's not the technology's fault. Like, criminals are criminals. We need to find a way to catch them and deal with it, right? But I think there's going to be that early cycle of scammers. Scammers are very quick adopters of technology, unfortunately.
Sure they are.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I do worry about that. I do worry about, I'm a high functioning ADHD person, right? So I can do lots of different things, and that's how I operate. But there are some people that are very focused in their work and their work product. And that I really do get concerned. Like, if you derive a lot of value by taking things out of your inbox and putting them into your outbox, and that's how you drive things, I do worry about that person, right? Like, how are they gonna? And I have a massive bias because I've been able to craft in the last 5 years the job that I wanted, right? I get to do what I love. I get to not do the things that I don't want to do. Like, it's just like, this is and so, like, even my family's like, of course you work all the time. Like, of course you work all the time because you love it. This is what you would be doing for free, kind of thing, right? And I'm super fortunate in the world of, like, things to be grateful for, that I've been able to do that for myself and my family. And it's just massive, right? It's just but what happens when your work is everything and some of this AI technology is able to do your work better than you?
Yeah.
And you just have defined so much of your life and your self-worth to your job. that worries me, right? And my hope for people is they kind of find what's next, right? It's a growth opportunity. And, growth mindset, all that stuff. There's plenty of books and blogs and pods on that, right?
That's right.
But it's such a huge and important thing. And that I think, if you looked at my resume, I'm highly unemployable. Because if like, God, you don't stick with anything for more than 3 years, right? Like, but I realized that there's a whole world out there of people with resumes that have only worked 2 jobs their entire life.
That's right.
And change is a massive challenge for them. So I do hope that it allows and gives people the opportunity to actually find the job they love versus the job that they have. But that's a big transition.
It is big. That could be the subject of an entire other podcast. So we'll kind of in cap there. I totally agree with you, by the way, that's there's a piece of that is unnerving a little bit. But I remain hopeful and full of growth mindset mentality. So the book is Creating the Intangible Enterprise. The author is KP Reddy. KP, thank you for investing this time with me today and with our community today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Where can people find the book, and where can they find you if they'd like to reach out?
Book is on Amazon and other book retailers. You can reach out to me at kpreddy.co. If you go there, there's information about my other books, blogs, pods, all the things that I do. And you can also contact me there. Like I said, I have a great team. So it's I'm surprisingly very approachable considering everything that's going on. Because my team has figured out like, who do I want to talk to? Right.
Yeah.
Like, and sometimes it's a student, quite honestly. It'll be a high schooler that somehow found something, and my team knows like, oh, KP wants to talk to that kid. Like, that's interesting to him. So they've done a good job of not just filtering like about business opportunity, but like, could a 15-minute conversation be meaningful to both of us?
Yeah, that makes sense. I love that. Well, I find you to be an incredibly approachable person and a fantastic human, and I just appreciate you immensely. For everybody else, we'll see you next time on the Multifamily Collective. Take care.
Thanks, Mike.